Okay, yeah, welcome to this week's episode of the Forestry Tomorrow podcast. It's episode 20, and today we have two guests, which we have been looking very much forward to. Actually, it's Ben Gunneberg. I hope I pronounced it correct, Ben.
Correct, yes.
And then Pedersen. Yeah, both of them, at least seen from our point of view, is quite some impressive gentlemen. So hopefully you'll be able to maybe present yourself and let everyone know who exactly you is. I don't know who want to go first.
Well, I'll go first if you like.
Yep.
Thanks for inviting both of us on to this podcast. I'm sure we're going to have a bit of fun. So yeah, you ask, how I got into interest in forestry. So it started at a young age with my mother teaching me of all the different tree species and wild plants, and I lived a few yards from a great big beach in the northwest of England, and I used to spend a lot of time in the sand dunes looking for lizards and caterpillars and natterjack toads and all sorts of things. So I've always had an interest in nature study, and famously my mother was called into school because apparently I wasn't very good at learning anything, and the teacher said, I can't teach him anything. The only thing he takes any interest in is nature study. So I suppose the trajectory was set at a very, very young age. But anyway, at the age of about 12, I set my heart on studying forestry, and I ended up doing a forestry degree at Bangor University in Wales. And then I did a master's in forestry at University of Oxford. And my first employment was with the UK government's aid programme. It was called the Overseas Development Administration in those days. And it was a fantastic thing to do, actually. So I had a relatively short, about 8 or 9 months, getting some work experience in Jamaica on a project that the UK government was supporting to establish pine forests, Pinus caribea, on deforested land. But my main stint was I did a 3.5 year stint in the South Pacific, in the western part of the Solomon Islands. I was on loan to the Solomon Island Government Forestry Department, and we had a small team of British and New Zealand people who were supporting the development of reforestation techniques. And we had lots of species trials, dozens of species were tested. My focus was on nursery techniques and field establishment techniques. And we ended up with a number of native species that worked really well in plantations, and a number of exotic species as well, such as teak and mahogany and some of the eucalyptus species from New Guinea. But Melina arborea was our sort of star performer, because we could plant it at 3 by 3 meters, and it would be closed canopy in about 8 months, which is quite extraordinary. And I went back 10 years later, and there was a project had been initiated at that time, so it's a commercial project, and it was great to see that they were using all the techniques that we developed. But it turned out that the rotation lengths that we predicted for some of these species were actually wrong, because they grew even more quickly than we'd anticipated. So the project that was developed, Columbangara Forest Plantations Limited, basically they were doing the faster growing species, and also introducing some of the slower growing species such as teak. So they're on and mahogany, and they're on a longer time frame, but still very short by European standards. So it's very good to see that happen. And it was actually the first forest in the Pacific to be certified by the FSC as sustainable. So it was a very remote volcanic island. It's 40 miles by canoe to the nearest shops, and the volcano used to shake a lot. And we had no phones, no communications. It was literally a sort of fork stick in the canoe. So it was a fantastic experience. You'd be in the canoe going off, and the dolphins would be going beside you, and the flying fish, and all the rest of it. But at the end of the day, I wanted to work in policy, so I decided to come back to the UK, and I got a job with the Timber Growers Association as technical director, and then 6 years as chief executive officer. And that's when I discovered this word certification. So my members, as you can imagine, perhaps were not as keen on certification as some other people. So initially, my role was to fight off this dreadful idea of certification, which was impinging on national sovereignty, etc., etc. But we ended up forging a solution, which was UKWAS, which we're going to talk about in more detail. But I then moved on from Timber Growers Association to the pan-industry umbrella, which encompassed all the different elements of the forest wood chain. That's Forest Industries Development Council. And we got certification sorted by that point. And my main focus there was, we had devolution in 1999, where the UK government set up parliaments and assemblies in the three other countries, so in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland. They had different administrations and therefore different approaches to forestry. So a big task in that era of my life was about trying to make sure that the forest strategies that were emerging from these new assemblies and parliaments actually took proper account of economic forestry, and a lot of time spent bending politicians' ears and things to make sure we were properly recognised. Then in 2004, I went independent, and I've done lots of projects since then, but I seem to have ended up with a significant focus on certification. So I've done projects on developing the Woodland Carbon Code in the UK, and also I was facilitated the establishment of the Sustainable Biomass Partnership for wood pellets and so on going into power stations in Europe. So various jobs. So certification came from nowhere, and it's been in my life for the last, whatever it is, 30 years or something. Yeah. So yeah, that's a quick rundown. So,
and I guess it's there to stay.
It looks like it. It'll see me into retirement, I think. Yes.
Yeah. Wow, what a impressive journey you've been on.
Yeah.
It's really interesting.
It's quite good to look
I'm
back
just
on.
at the start of that journey.
Yeah, you're right.
I have a lot to experience.
Well, Benjamin, he's actually in the Danish it's called forest and landscape engineer, but a forester.
Yeah.
My background is the engineering software, so
Don't
he's
ask
the
me
clever
about
guy when it comes to
software. Is not my strong point.
I was actually wondering the education to become like a forester in the UK, has that changed from when you became a forester to now?
Fundamentally, I suspect it hasn't really changed, but there's been a diminution in the number of traditional universities that do forestry courses. So very sadly, Edinburgh and Oxford no longer have forestry courses. And there's been a growth in perhaps more technically based institutions, so producing people who are probably much better than me at doing the practical stuff on the ground. But the two traditional universities, Bangor and one that Ben will remember fondly, Aberdeen, are still going strong, which is good news. I don't know, what else, Ben? What else can we say about that side of things?
I think there's a lot more people coming in with a broader range of skill sets. There's an apprentice system now that you can actually work and get a university degree at the same time. So there's lots of new ways of becoming, for example, a chartered foresters. Both Peter and I are, well, I'm a member of the Institute of Chartered Foresters. Peter is a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Foresters. And that's the sort of organization which brings in a whole range of people involved with environmental issues and trees, to be professional foresters and work in the professional forestry sector, covering everything from environmental, social, and economic issues. So it's changed a bit, and it's for the good, and it's why, let's say, less so the traditional universities and more so now professional bodies such as the Institute of Chartered Foresters have become much more important as a means of ensuring the quality, the consistency of the advice, the professionalism of the advice which foresters now give in the UK.
Yeah, and Ben and I have a get together annually because we have a team of people who assess candidates to become members of the Institute of Chartered Foresters. Well, it's very interesting because you get people from all sorts of backgrounds. And most of them are pretty good. Sometimes we have to say, no, I'm afraid you're not up to it, but try again next year. No, it's very interesting being involved in that process of assessing the candidates.
Yeah.
Okay. I can maybe. Of course, Ben, you also need need to present yourself, but it seems like the two of you go way back. Now I don't know when the two of you met each other, but looking at the way that you sort of yeah, okay.
I'll tell you about it.
Okay, go ahead, Ben.
So I was actually a city boy in Glasgow, and my father was a Church of Scotland minister. He ended up in a small place called Tyndrum. I had my heart set on medicine, and I actually went to study medicine at Glasgow University until I discovered that I feel faint, and I do sometimes faint at the sight of blood. So medicine wasn't the right career for me. I ended up back in Tyndrum, which is north of Crianlarich. For those of you who know, Crianlarich is the second most signposted place in the United Kingdom. It's a small village of about 128 people, and Tyndrum's about the same size. And I spent a lot of time there whilst I was deciding what to do once I was no longer doing medicine, with a retired forester who basically decided to put his boots on. We put our boots on. We ended up climbing the hills, looking all over the place. And that's how my passion for forestry started. I ended up then starting off, first of all, as a general unskilled forestry worker in the Forestry Commission, and as a subcontractor, self-employed subcontractor as well, before I started studying forestry at Aberdeen University. Once I completed that, I was very fortunate to spend some time at the university in Bangor as a research officer looking into private sector forestry costs, which was a project which the Forestry Commission was looking at to see how much grants should be paid. And so that was something I was doing in England and Wales for 3 years. And through that, I got to meet a lot of forest owners. And then Peter advertised for a technical officer in the Timber Growers Association. And I remember I was interviewed in Wales for that. And so I joined Peter in about 1992 or 93? I can't remember. Anyway, I joined Peter then. and worked with him for quite a few years. Became a chartered forester, also decided to do an MBA at the time with the Open University. And that's when certification came our way. So I did several jobs for Peter, technical officer, development officer, and finally technical director. And as we say, when certification came along, my knowledge of languages, I have 3 nationalities. I'm British, German, and French. Came in handy.
Wow.
And I then basically used that to negotiate and discuss with a lot of the forest owners in Europe at the time, who were discussing setting up this organization called the PEFC, at that time known as the Pan-European Forest Certification Council. And I was asked to basically help set up that organization, which I did initially from the offices of the Timber Growers Association. And then later on, I was offered to run PEFC. So I moved to Luxembourg with my wife, and we set up the first PEFC international office there, and spent 8 years there, then came down to Geneva. And so 3 years ago, I became self-employed. I'm now working for a range of actors, developing national standards, for example, for the tropical forest countries. So I do some work with Timber Development UK, and I also do work for some recycling organizations, some forestry companies, some of the electronic companies preparing themselves for the EUDR requirements and so on. So there were a lot of new computing companies that were coming around providing software, and I did some work with them.
Yeah.
And so just a whole range of issues. Got involved in the Institute of Chartered Foresters, was really passionate about that, and had a little bit more time than before, so went back to doing something, giving back a little bit. So I also work 2 days a week in a food bank, 1 day as a driver and 1 day stacking shelves. And then the rest of my time doing, the UKWAS. I'm now the chair of the UKWAS process, and I'm really delighted to be working with Peter again, because Peter and I worked very well. He was an excellent boss, and now I'm your boss, aren't I, Peter?
Yeah.
Only on a
Around.
so
And
that's where we are.
is it also working excellent for you, Peter?
Oh, well, the jury is still out. No. Yeah, definitely excellent. Yes, Ben.
Yeah. So PFC, you know yourself, it's a massive organization, global, 300 million hectares. And of course, we lost a lot when we lost Russia and Belarus for a while, as did FSC. And so they're still out. And of course, there are some other countries which are challenging, like Myanmar and so on. So it was an interesting time. It was a time to meet a lot of cultures, to do a lot of traveling around the world, and really, really quite proud about how PFC has developed and continues to develop, and wishing it luck, as well as their competitors and colleagues in the FSC as well. Wish them luck as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, that's quite a CV you got as well, Pin. I must say. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, the reason why we sort of came to know UKWAS is because we have a company on the side and are looking into expanding that into UK, and then UKWAS we came across UKWAS, and so that's of course sort of our main reason to why we wanna talk to you. Of course, there's a lot of other things we could talk as well about, but let's start with UKWAS. I don't know. Could you share some of the journey of the first few years and then all the way up to where we are today with UKWAS?
Yeah, perhaps I can kick off on that one. It's an interesting tale, to be honest with you, and we probably should write a book on it, but I've forgotten most of it, so it's not going to happen. I think the first thing to say is there's a lot of focus on the UK for a long time, not because we were a major timber grower, because we were an absolute minnow in terms of timber production in the global context. But the UK was one of the top 3 timber importers in the world. So that was why the NGOs and people had an interest in the UK sector. So I think for the UK domestic growers, it rather felt like they'd been caught in the crosshairs. But the story really starts going right back to the First World War. Because there was a naval blockade, of course, and we needed timber particularly for pit props in the coal mines. And this was traditionally imported either from the Baltics or from Canada and other places. So a lot of the tree cover that we had was lost in the First World War. So by the end of the First World War, depending which figures you believe, it was somewhere between 3 to 5% of the country was wooded. So very, very low. A bit like Denmark, I think. You have very low woodland cover too. So after the war, a forestry commission was established to try and set up a strategic reserve of timber in case there was going to be another war. But of course, by the time the next war came along, the timber wasn't much. Trees weren't very big, so they weren't terribly useful. But the strategy sort of emerged from there, and it turned into firstly moving on from just being about producing timber. The Forestry Commission was charged with looking at social and environmental aspects too. But anyway, the private sector was also involved, and there were various schemes that the government had to encourage private planting, including a very favourable tax regime, which certainly from the early 1980s, if not before, there was a lot of private sector planting. There's an upland focus because the land is cheap, and it was very much focusing on exotic species, Sitka spruce being the primary one. And this was controversial, basically, very controversial. And the fact that pop stars and media people were basically getting tax breaks to plant these great square blocks of Sitka spruce and things on a hillside it was in the press all the time, basically. We do now have 13.5% woodland cover, so it's a massive step up from where we were 100 years ago.
Did you say 13.5?
13.5, yeah. Yeah.
Is it increasing still?
It is increasing, yeah. Most of the planting is in Scotland, which is very much a sort of coniferous part of the world. The timber, the woodlands you get in the southern part of England and so on are really quite different, mainly broadleaved, some of them very ancient. But the commercial side of things is very much focused on conifer, and the sawmill sector is very much based on the sort of Swedish model of sawmills. But to go back a step, the sort of first attempt really by the private sector to set out a code of good practice on following the 3 pillars of environmental, social and economic responsibilities was something called the Forestry and Woodland Code, which was produced by the Timber Growers Association in 1985. And it was very much ahead of its time because no one else had produced anything quite like it. But that really went part of the way towards a solution, and things were still very controversial. So 1996 was another pivotal breakthrough because the Institute of Chartered Foresters facilitated a sort of roundtable of social NGOs, environmental NGOs, and business people, and developed a set of objectives and principles for responsible forestry. And this was called the UK Forestry Accord. And it was launched with great fanfare and government ministers and so on in London. And that marked a major step forward, because what it demonstrated was that actually everyone agreed about what forestry should look like, and that we weren't enemies. We were all basically working and looking at the same thing, but with a slightly different angle. But it became very, I think, politicized, because WWF and some of the other NGOs in the UK were putting us under increasing pressure to go forward with this idea of voluntary, in inverted commas, certification to FSC. And that became very controversial, and there was really a deadlock between the forestry sector and the NGOs at that point. I've often likened it to sort of trench warfare. But the Forestry Commission, as the government department, stepped in 1997 and set up what they called a technical working group. And they were basically facilitating a process with a range of stakeholder groups, and looking to develop what we called at that point an audit protocol on sustainable forest management. So it was quite a fractious exercise, but we got there in the end. And in 1990, one of the things we didn't have was a document that set out in one document all the various rules and regulations and restrictions and aspirations for forestry in the UK. And the private sector, the timber growers, have been pushing for the government to produce something. So in 1998, they produced a UK Forestry Standard. And we still have that UK Forestry Standard, and it's updated every so often. A new edition came out last year. And that sets out all the regulatory requirements and also the good practice requirements very comprehensively. So that was a major move forward. In 1998, we got to the stage where we were trying to negotiate, with me as representing the timber growers, trying to negotiate with the NGOs about how we could have a kind of certification approach which didn't make us completely beholden to one certification scheme. Because people in the industry very much felt that that was a question of sovereignty, and we shouldn't be subjected to a self-appointed organisation as it was seen at the time. So we eventually reached a situation where it was agreed that the ownership of any certification standard that we came up with must rest with the stakeholders, and that all decisions must be based on consensus. And we had a very strong definition of consensus. Consensus means no sustained opposition. So in practice, it means everyone has a veto. So people felt comfortable that they couldn't be bulldozed into having some requirements that they were very unhappy with. So moving on from that agreement we reached in 1998, in 1999 it launched something called the UK Woodland Assurance Scheme. And this is really the outcome of the Forestry Commission's facilitation process with the technical working group. So at the end of 1999, we had a draft standard, and that standard was approved by the FSC as meeting their requirements, their principles and criteria, and is recognised as a national forest stewardship standard. it was quite different from the FSC standards. It didn't follow the FSC standards in terms of the way it was set out or anything else, but it was set out in such a way that it was actually meaningful to UK stakeholders. It had lots of nuance in it. People recognised the terminology that was used, the various legal requirements, and so on. So it went down well with the sector. One of the things that we did change fairly early on was the name, because it was originally called it the UK Woodland Assurance Scheme. The NGOs were worried about that because they felt that it's not a scheme, it's just a standard. And the last thing we want you to do is to set up another scheme in opposition, if it were, to the existing FSC scheme. So we had some long discussions on that, and we changed the name to Standard, and it was agreed that we would not ever try to do anything beyond standard setting. Now, in 2002, a new organisation called PEFC, I think it was, Ben, came along. There was no PEFC, there was no second scheme in the offing when we came up with the rule that any other standard would be recognised if we thought it was up to scratch. So that showed some foresight, because PEFC came along, and in 2002 they endorsed the UKWAS as being a PEFC national scheme, and that meant that we could have dual certification in the UK. So with one audit, you could have endorsement from PEFC. You could be certified to both PEFC and FSC, which was a big step forward, I think, and quite unique. Other countries have taken an interest in it and asked us all about it, but I think one or two have even tried to emulate it, but no one else has succeeded. So that was really how we got to where we are. Just on the sort of institutional side, in 2002 we set up a not-for-profit company to own and manage UKWAS on behalf of the various stakeholders. And another thing we developed later on, 5 years later, was concordats. So we developed concordats between UKWAS and both FSC UK and PEFC UK, which clearly set out the role of each party. And we've updated those once or twice. So that's a sort of, in a nutshell, I think the story. We're now on the 4th revision, and we can talk a bit more about that in a while.
I think, Jens, what's quite interesting about this is that the UKWAS itself has been a success story in terms that it actually managed to keep the process going and continue getting the endorsement of both FSC and PEFC. Similar initiatives were done in the past. Some people might even remember that in the 1990s there was the Living Forest Standard initiative in Norway, which by 1998 had a comprehensive standard for sustainable forest management. And that formed the basis of both FSC and PEFC certification in Norway. It was again revised 2006. They did that for a while with an input from a whole broad range of stakeholders. But in 2010, unfortunately, the Living Forest Standard initiative from Norway was suspended due to unresolved disagreements between the various stakeholders. So you had a separate PEFC and a separate FSC standard setting processes at that time. Similarly, in Sweden, you had an attempt to try and bring the two standards together. And that was called the Stock Dove Initiative. And that was actually launched in about 2002 2 or 3 or 4 at that time, with the aim of comparing FSC and PEFC forest certification standards and trying to achieve some kind of a harmonized approach for the Swedish market. It did reach a level where they basically got to the stage where they said, yes, the standards are parallel and so on. And that was around 2006. But although this common ground was achieved effectively for probably more political reasons, the various stakeholders went their separate ways and developed something else. And where UKWAS has been unique is that we've managed to keep that consensus going between the stakeholders, which meant that maybe external actors couldn't influence so much that approach, and both PEFC and FSC had to work with the standard setting processes that were there. PEFC has always been a bottom-up approach and has always encouraged stakeholders to develop their own national standard. So there's a large variety, about 55 standards now within PEFC. And certification isn't even new, because the American tree farm system, which was set up by the American Forest Foundation's first certification system, is about 50 years old just now. So it's a long system to try and encourage smallholders to manage their forests in a sustainable manner. And the other large certification system, which is part of PEFC and endorsed by PEFC, is the SFI, which also started in the 1990s. So there were quite a few movements going. PEFC tried to pull them all together under umbrella of national systems and try to get those benchmarked. UKWAS was then one of the standards that PEFC UK could then work on and ensure that whoever followed the UKWAS standard could get certified to both PEFC and or FSC if they so wished.
Yeah. Okay. So it seems like those early 2000s, there was other countries trying to emulate something like UKWAS. Is that a lost call now, or do you see this maybe becoming a thing again in the future?
It depends.
Or is it simply too?
Depends on the stakeholders. I think the more and more, as I said, you could put a cigarette paper between the differences between the various standards, but there are sort of institutional, political, cultural differences which would have to be overcome. But it's really behoven on the certification movement to respond to the desires of the stakeholders. So if the stakeholders wanted to have this, we'd have to respond to that, yes. Or they would have to respond to it. I no longer work for any of the certification systems. I now work for a volunteer to work with the UKWAS, which I think is an excellent example for others to follow.
Yeah,
I think it's actually perhaps more difficult now because the FSC system has become perhaps rather more what's the right word? It's sort of stricter in the sense that it's very keen on having exact terminology, and there's less scope for variance with FSC than there was back in the day when we were developing UKWAS. Yeah. So I think it'd be more difficult to do it now than it was back in the day.
I guess also with the what's it called? I just had the word in my mind.
Don't worry, it happens to me all the
time. What's it called? Ecosystem tjenester.
Ecosystem service.
Yeah, with all those new, let's say, products, I guess it also makes it more complex.
Yeah, yes, it does. I mean, there's a trees outside forest standard within PEFC, so that you can certify town forests, parks within the cities. I mean, many cities like London, 20% of the surface area is covered in trees. Why shouldn't they be certified? It's a fantastic way to communicate with the general public about the value of trees and about the value of managing those trees in a sustainable way, and then linking that knowledge and that understanding of maybe urban trees to what's happening in the countryside. So there's a lot of potential there for the certification systems to exploit and make use of. But yes, of course, they're all moving in different ways. Yes, there's ecosystem services. There's obviously carbon. There's a whole range of other initiatives involved as well. Even other forest products from forests, particularly important when you're dealing with tropical countries, because so many people depend on for their livelihoods on the foods from the forests and so on. So increasingly it becomes challenging, but it's really a question of how people want to organize themselves to pull together the ideas and how the marketplace responds to that. I mean, certification in a way, we're now, 25, 30 years into the processes, maybe even a bit more. When you use the American ones, even longer. But then, we were at one stage at 13% of the forest area certified. It's now 9% when you look at the double certifications between FSC and PEFC. This is the area that's there, and so actually we have a lot of challenges on our hands globally to bring more of the forests into verified forest verification, if you want to call it that. You can call it certification or whatever, but there has to be that, and it may not necessarily be to the kind of the gold standards that both FSC and PEFC are delivering. It may be that we have to meet more the requirements of what the Lacey Act, the EUDR, or the Green Timber initiatives in Japan and in South Korea are asking for. I mean, there's a lot more to be done to provide assurances that basically timber doesn't come from deforestation, and that the forests are well managed, and that people can actually have sustainable livelihoods from them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Okay, so with all the iterations of UKWAS, what's the difference between them?
I think one of the key things is that the first edition, the main driving force there was environmental issues. So if you go back and look at UKWAS 1, a lot of it was about the environment. As we've gone on, there's been an expansion of the issues in the social and particularly the social issues and other issues like this. For example, in this version of the standard, there's been a lot of focus on things like carbon, and there's been a big focus on things like the historic environment, which people thought was inadequately represented in the previous version. So we've been very responsive to the various sort of subsets, if you like, of the social and the social, in particularly the social side of things. So yes, it's been an evolutionary process, and we do aim to have an ethos of continuous improvement. The standards actually are based on several things. We start off with the UK. We start off with where we were with the last standard. Yeah. We then ask people to, before we even start work, we ask for people stakeholders to send us ideas about what they think needs to be changed. And then we sit down with a stakeholder group, and slightly losing my train of thought here. We're looking at the UK Forestry Standard. Have there been changes there? Are there legal changes that need to be taken into account? Are there changes in the science that need to be taken into account? What are the changes to the two certification schemes, which the FSC and the PEFC have changed their rules? We have to take that into account. So, and then there's things like EUDR come along. That's a bit of a left field thing. So all of these things have to be taken into account. In fact, the way we set the standard is actually more demanding than, I think, certainly than FSC, and I think the same for PEFC, that we have this initial consultation, and then we have a 60. We come up with a first version of the standard, a first draft, revised draft. Then we have a 60-day consultation. Then we try a second draft, and then we have another 60-day consultation, and then we try and pin down the final details, and eventually send it off to PEFC UK, FSC UK, who then remit it to their parent bodies. So it's an interesting exercise, and I think the thing that makes it work is this consensus that I talked about earlier, that basically everyone has a veto.
Yeah.
And we've had some problems more recently where there has been some divergence, and this first occurred with between the requirements of the two standards. So the first occasion on this was about highly hazardous chemicals, which FSC introduced as a concept, and this went further than the PEFC requirements. So how were we going to tackle that? In the end, we found a solution, which was we simply added a note in the standard to say, for this section, check with your certification body or your group scheme manager as to whether there are any additional scheme requirements. So you put down all the requirements that are common into the standard, and where there's some divergence, we use that little technique. And we've had an example this time in UKWAS 5 where for the conversion requirements, the PEFC had some additional requirements. I never could quite get my head around them, but it was about sort of percentage limits of what you could, the size of your conversion, which was different approach to the FSC approach. So again, we've put in a little note to say, check with your CB or group scheme manager for any additional requirements. And that seems to work. But it may well be we get even more challenging issues in the future.
The problem is,
what's the sort of go on, Ben.
Now the problem is, of course, that there are many different factors affecting the development of standards and what the certification systems require. That can be legislative requirements. It can actually requirements on things such as the central point of expertise on timber, CPET, which is a UK process which looks at it and has requirements, and then the certification systems require that. The Dutch did quite a lot of assessments of certification systems, and actually the requirement that Peter's talking about there originally came in from that one, because basically the Dutch government was basically saying we will only accept it if you actually define what a limited amount of deforestation, which is legitimately allowed for development building purposes of towns, cities, infrastructure, and so on. If you define what that actually is as a percentage, so that something that one had to do, and then in order to be accepted and continue to be accepted in certain marketplaces, those requirements then had to be implemented over all of the national systems, regardless of whether it applied to them or not. So that's why poor UKWAS had to put in some notes about what the percentages would be or could be allowed.
I didn't know that's where it came from, Ben.
There you go.
It's interesting.
It's historical, and it's about keeping the certification movement relevant to the marketplaces, and the marketplaces change their requirements, and people have to adapt accordingly. Yeah.
The main theories that have come up with UKWAS 5 at this point in the game actually relate to the processing of the standards. So we've always, and the working group that actually develops the drafts in the UK, we've always done it on time. This latest version has not been very successful in getting launched on the correct date. It should have been launched on the 1st of April 2023.
Yeah.
The FSC's latest timetable for completing its assessment of our draft standard is 2026. So it's really very dispiriting for all concerned. So it's just nothing to do with the UK level of FSC. They've been fantastic. But at international level, they're just very slow in assessing the draft standards. I can't understand why they don't have an efficient production line, because that's the essence of it. It's like a car factory, and you turn off the conveyor belt with all the cars on it. They need to speed it up. So we're now in a very difficult situation because PEFC has endorsed UKWAS 5.
Yeah.
And they waited as long as they could according to PEFC rules, but by the 1st of December, they had to go live. So UKWAS 5 came in for PEFC certificate holders on the 1st of December 2024. And then we've got this situation where we might be 2026 before FSC gets to the same point. And then, of course, the schemes are out of sync. Luckily, we think that we might be able to get them back into sync because I think PEFC has a 5 to 7 year window for revisions, whereas FSC has a 5-year window. So by my calculations, we might be able to bring them back into sync in 2031, but with a fair wind. But whether we can keep them in sync, I don't know. It's very disheartening, and I know that my colleagues in FSC UK just find it very, very difficult. They have to defend the situation, but there we are.
What do you do now then? If you want to be FSC certified, do you look at the UKWAS 4?
Yes, that's exactly the situation. So if you're dual certified, you can still be dual certified, but obviously for the certification bodies are going to have to develop different protocols and all the rest of it. So it just adds, it's going to add to perhaps to cost and certainly to the burden on the CVs and the certificate holders. So it's unfortunate.
It's behoven on the international systems to, as I say, to sort out that production line. I have to say, having been in charge of one of the production lines myself in the past, the problem is that it's not like you have 55 standards and every year you've got there's 6 or whatever standards coming through. They all tend to come like buses one after the other. So you suddenly have 27 standards wanting to be assessed in 1 year. And you don't have the resources and so on. And then other years you have absolutely practically nothing happening, at least in the early days. So, you've got to sort of justify how you do that. But of course, that's not an excuse. That's just an explanation as to why sometimes these bottlenecks happen. But it's behoven on the international systems to find a way to do that. It's one of the reasons we extended the period from 5 to make it possible to allow for 7 years, a bit more flexibility. And I suspect if FSC did exactly the same, then that would allow people to become much more in sync when they're developing national standards. So, and it is frustrating. I shouldn't have laughed, but I laughed because I remember sitting at the other side, getting letters in from people saying we need to have you move faster on this, and you're sort of going, whoa, there's a lot happening here. But you need to make sure your customers' expectations are met, and so it's behoven on the international systems to do that, as it is on us at UKWAS to make sure that we are always on time for when the revisions are required to be endorsed by either FSC or PEFC. So everybody has to play their part.
Yeah. On a more positive note, we do have 44% of the UK forests certified, most of them, I think, to dual certification. And I just looked back at some figures this morning, and it is inching up, but I think it's basically a sort of stable situation. But looking ahead, I think we have to think about whether certification as we know it is going to endure, or whether it's going to be a sort of transitional system. Looking at things like EUDR and the UK's equivalent forest risk commodity regulation, maybe legality will sort of become more important than voluntary certification. Who knows? But we have to be aware of those sort of challenges, I think, coming down the road.
Yeah. Okay. Well, actually, I think I just looked at the time. We actually sort of ran out in terms of minutes.
We could have done
so
more.
maybe we should. Sorry, Peter.
I'm saying we could have done more. There's an awful lot of things we didn't cover, but you're right.
Yeah. Maybe we should do a part 2.
Yeah, we can do a part.
Yeah.
Yes.
At least
good idea.
I'll be happy to do that.
Let's do it.
Okay. Great. Okay, but thank you so much, Ben and Peter. It's been an absolutely pleasure talking to you. Yeah, I don't know what to say. I'm just very happy and yeah, it's been very knowledgeable. Thank you so much.
Okay.
No, it's good fun. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you very much for inviting us. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Take care.
Take care.
Talk to you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.